In this lesson, we're going to go over how can I write, solve, and graph inequalities. And that should be a question mark. There we go. So the first thing I want to review is a couple symbols. For inequalities, we have 4 symbols we want to look at. We have greater than, we have less than, we have two new ones. So these are ones you're probably familiar with. You've probably seen greater than, less than. Basically, you eat the bigger number, and if it's sort of like this, then it looks kind of like a sideways L, you read it as less than, and the other one's greater than. Okay, so here are the 2 new ones that you may not have seen before. They are greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. And it basically is the exact same symbol, but there's a line underneath it. And you might think, like, traditionally when you're comparing 2 numbers, oh, well, you always can kind of tell if it's greater than or less than. Like, if it's equal to, why don't you just say it's equal to? Well, it's because sometimes we don't know. When we're dealing with algebraic expressions and comparing those, we don't necessarily know because it depends on what the variable or variables are. So we don't know. It could be greater than or it could be equal to, depending on what the variable is. So you want to make sure that we use these to basically differentiate between, oh, it's definitely greater than, or it's greater than, or it could be equal to as well. So keep that as a possibility. Or it could be less than or equal to. So these are just those symbols. It's the same symbol, just with a line underneath. That means it could also be equal. The first 3 things I want to talk about are just simply some vocabulary and just using some little fill-in-the-blank sentences. You blank an inequality when you determine the values of the variables that make the inequality true. So for this one, you're looking at an inequality, and what an inequality is that is when you have 2 algebraic expressions or 2 numbers that you are comparing that aren't equal, or they could be equal to, but you're comparing using greater than, less than, greater than equal to, or less than or equal to. So you're comparing 2 algebraic expressions using this symbol, and you can actually solve them by determining what the values of the variable are that make it true. You blank the inequality symbol when you multiply or divide each side of an inequality by a negative value. So you can actually solve these just by using inverse operations, and sometimes you're going to multiply or divide an inequality, and in that case, you actually, when you do that, it actually reverses the inequality symbol if it's a negative value. If you multiply or divide by a negative number, it reverses the inequality. And then finally, you graph an inequality on a number line with an open or closed circle and array. And then the open or closed circle, it's open if it's just greater than or less than, and it would be closed if it is potentially equal to that solution. So we've talked about inequality, we've gone over some vocabulary. Now let's go to an actual problem. We are going to read the problem, and then we're going to write, solve, and graph an inequality. Tyler needs to buy a book for school that costs $13. He also wants to get a book for each of his 2 sisters, and he wants to be sure he spends the same amount on each of their books. He only has $27 to spend. Let B represent the amount he can spend on each additional book. Okay, so he needs to spend less than or equal to $27. So whatever he's doing is going to be less than or equal to $27. Then we know that he already has 13, so he's already spent 13. So 13 of those dollars would already be spent, plus the amount he spends on the additional books, and it says B is going to represent those, but he needs to get one for each of his 2 sisters. So 2 sisters, and he's going to spend the same amount on each of their books. So it's going to be 2 times B. 2B plus 13 needs to be less than, or it can be equal to 27. That is our inequality. Now we have written an inequality. Now we need to solve it. To solve it, you simply use the same way you would solve an algebraic equation. And we ignore the inequality and kind of treat it as an equal sign. So with the exception of if we multiply or divide by a negative, we reverse it. And that's what it says up here. So we'll basically just, in this one, we're going to do 2 steps. Minus 13, and you end up with 2b is less than or equal to 27 minus 13, which is 14. 2b is less than or equal to 14. We then divide by 2. This is a positive number, so we're okay. We divide by 2. We do not need to switch the inequality. So we end up with b is less than or equal to 7, or 14 divided by 2. Finally comes the third step. We have written, check. We have solved, check. Now we're going to graph the inequality. To graph the inequality, you will use a number line. On the number line, you're going to plot the point that b equals. So b is going to, or that b is less than or equal to. B is going to be less than or equal to 7. So we put a 7 there. So we have the 7 here. We could include other numbers on this. We could do 6, 5, but we don't really need it. We might just put an 8 here. So we have 7, 6, and 8, and we know that b is going to be less than or equal to 7. So we go to the 7, and we're going to put a circle, but because it could be equal to, we fill in the circle. So we have what is called a closed point. We're going to put a closed circle here because it could be equal to 7. So B7 would be a solution for this problem, and it has to be less than or equal to 7. So in this case, where you would then shade, or I like to just draw a line straight down the number line, and any number that is less than or equal to 7 would solve this problem. And this would be the inequality to solve the problem. Realistically, I doubt that he would be doing any number, because could he do a negative? That would be like where a negative number, where he buys the book for negative money, that someone not only gives him the book but also pays him to take it. That kind of seems silly and doesn't seem very realistic. So I would say that, like, yes, realistically anything less than 7, but 0 would probably be the lowest you would want to go if they asked you to come up with potential solutions and in a real life situation. However, mathematically, anything that is equal to or less than 7, and you would represent that on the graph like this, with a solid dot at 7 and then an arrow pointing all the way to the left, counting down. And that means that 8 would not work. And you know that 8 wouldn't work because if you substituted it back in, 2 times 8 is 16. Let's go ahead and do that. 2 times 8 is 16 plus 13, and 16 plus 13 is 29. And so 29 is not less than or equal to 27, so you wouldn't have enough money. But if you did 7, 7 times 2 is 14 plus 13. 14 plus 13 would equal 27, so you have just enough money then to have that one work. So 7 would work, and anything less than 7 would also work. So if you were to like list out values, you could be like, oh, 7 would work, 6 would work, 5 would work, $4.50 would work. Anything less than 7 would work in terms of the price of the book. And so now I have shown you how can I write, solve, and we just graphed an inequality.